army unit that I'm researching, the 4th Logistics Company, well, it turns out I was wrong. They didn't all get disbanded at the end of World War II. They were definitely scaled right back, much like everything else, but it looks like they carried on working, searching out weird and creepy stuff that the rest of the British Army came across. And one of those things that happened after the war ended took place down in Somerset, in a place called Cheddar Gorge. I'd heard of cheddar. Who hasn't? I mean, the cheese had to be named after somewhere, right? But I didn't know it was named after an actual landmark. I just thought it was like a town or a family surname or something. Well, Cheddar Gorge is real, and it was formed right back in the Ice Age. An absolute ton of meltwater spent centuries cutting down a 150-metre slice right through the weak limestone there. Over the years, this process resulted in numerous caves and tunnels getting eaten down into the sides of the gorge. Most of those would then get sealed off by ice that formed across them or falling rubble that came down when the ice thawed and the entrances collapsed. Some of those caves are deep. I mean, like really deep. Nobody really knows how many there are, or what might have got trapped inside them over the years, unable to get back out again. Apparently, at the start of 1953, there was a massive storm that swept through Europe, killed about 2,500 people across the continent, and flooded all the coastal regions. Most of the UK fatalities were up in the northeast, but the storm hit hard everywhere else as well, including Somerset. One morning in February, a walker in Cheddar Gorge found what looked like a cave mouth that had been exposed by the storm. It was just about big enough for him to look inside, and when he did, he immediately ran off back into town to call the police. Well, the first thing they did when they heard his story was call for the army, and the first thing they did was send down a team from the 4th Logistics Company to investigate, supported by a company of regular infantrymen. The man in charge of that team was a former Royal Marine Commando called Captain Don Rich. He'd got promoted to an officer as a result of his wartime service and was pretty much their front of house guy in the post-war years. It was his field report that was included in those papers that my contact handed me, and it's pretty insane reading. Having got the police to cordon off both ends of the gorge, using falling rocks and flooding as an excuse, Rich and his men went down for a closer look. It was clear the cave was a lot bigger than the small entrance that had been exposed, and once they'd cleared some more rocks away, it was easy enough to get in. And there, about 20 metres inside, they found out what had scared the wits out of the dog walker. A human body, well, a percentage of one, at least. The remains of a British soldier was sticking half out the side of one of the tunnel walls, almost like they'd somehow been attached to the limestone there. He was wearing an old pattern uniform, likely World War I, which had been preserved by the lack of temperature variation in the cave system. It was this, and the absence of any animal predation, that had kept the corpse intact for the past 40-odd years, welded up against the cave wall. Rich's description of the man's face isn't a nice read. One exposed eye, wide open in terror, half a mouth formed in a terrible scream. On close inspection, the fabric of the uniform and the bones of the body itself stopped directly on contact with the smooth rock, almost as if the chap had slipped or fallen directly into the tunnel wall, and it had been porous at the time but suddenly hardened around him. But this poor sod was only the beginning. Having documented as much as they could of the body and realised they couldn't remove it from the wall without doing any damage, Rich and his team moved on. Up ahead, the cave started to descend, and as soon as they'd gone a little further down, they found their way blocked. But not by debris, by a tank. Massive British tank, just like you've seen in paintings and photos from the Great War. The tank just about fitted into the tunnel and didn't allow for any room to go over it or around it, pretty much filling the passage. Rich would later establish it was a Mark V, a female, and it was equipped with heavy machine guns rather than a cannon. On the back of it, someone had painted a name, the Wookiee Witch, and there was a crude picture of a witch and a broomstick next to it. It was this that later helped the team identify what unit the tank belonged to, which was the Gloucester Regiment, a unit that had been based a few miles away at Weston-super-Mare during World War I. Opening the rear hatches, Don Rich and his men were aghast to find another body inside. Only this time it was just the lower torso and legs of a human being. Again, attached to the right side of the tank, up to the waist, as if the body had been in the act of being pulled or dragged out through the metal that had suddenly hardened again around it. The inside of the tank was filled with brass casings, making it hard to get across, indicating that the machine guns there had been fired pretty much to exhaustion, and there was no sign of the rest of the crew. When Rich and the others managed to crawl out through one of the front viewing ports, they turned back and shone their torches down the exterior of the tank, and there they found a narrow section of the dead tank gunner's torso stretched out between the outside of the tank's armour and the tunnel wall, bridging it, disappearing completely from sight into the limestone, one arm dangling down uselessly between the tank and the rock face. And again, there was no gap between where the metal and the rock met the bone, like the body had somehow glued or knitted the two surfaces together. As they pushed on, deeper into the tunnel, leaving two of their number behind to document the tank, Captain Rich and his team found more bodies, never fully exposed, always having parts that were disappearing off into the walls or the floor of the tunnel. Sometimes it was a pair of legs sticking out of a wall. Other times it was an arm or the upper half of a body jutting up out the floor. Always with a look of pure horror on its face. There was kit strewn about everywhere, helmets, rifles, and more shell casings lying over the floor. They'd fought hard, these guys. The investigation team walked slowly. They checked and examined everybody as they did so, constantly scanning the tunnel up ahead. It was when Richard crouched down to retrieve an abandoned leather satchel that they all heard something. Something each man of the party would later describe as a sharp, scratching sound, as if someone were drawing the bladed end of a bayonet slowly across the rock of the tunnel. All of them trained their torches further into the darkness, looking for any signs of what might cause the sound. And there was a cry. One of the men claimed he'd seen something, or someone, emerge from one wall of the tunnel, and then pass directly before them, disappearing into the opposite wall. It was shortly after this they heard the same sound again, the scratching, only this time from behind them, between them and the tank. By this stage, Richard opened up the satchel and had a quick look at a pocketbook that was inside, the contents of which caused him to call for an immediate withdrawal. Pacing quickly, still aiming the torches down the tunnel, the group fell back to the tank. They retrieved the two men they'd left there, clambered through it, and sealed the viewing port shut. Then they hurried back up to the cave mouth, where Captain Rich gave orders for the regular soldiers who had accompanied him to use explosives to seal the tunnel. Properly this time, so there was no chance of a storm or anything else ever opening it again. In his report, Don Rich identifies the owner of the pocketbook he retrieved as an officer from the Gloucesters, the same regiment the tank had come from. The last couple of entries in it detailed how they'd been ordered by the army to go into a cave that had recently been found in the gorge, a cave that several locals had gone into, along with a policeman who'd gone looking for him, and none had come back. The first group of soldiers that went into the cave were about halfway down the tunnel system when one of them had given a scream and disappeared. 1 minute he'd been standing there, walking along at the rear. The next they'd heard him cry out, and when his colleagues turned round, it was just his rifle, lying on the ground. The group was still trying to get their heads around this, when something had lunged out of the cave wall beside them, a solid rock wall, and wrapped its arms around one of the other men. That poor sod hadn't even had a chance to cry out before he was gone, dragged into the wall, only for the lower part of his right leg to be left visible, still leaning into the rock. At this point, the group had quite rightly lost its mind and fled back up to the surface to tell their CO what had happened. A bigger party had gone down next, only to experience the same unearthly ambush. A solitary shadowy figure, almost dark green or dark blue in their torchlight, either emerging up from the floor or from the side walls of the tunnel, reaching out for the men, grabbing them, hauling and dragging them directly into the rock, leaving their bodies either half exposed and dead or sometimes gone completely. Any efforts to free the victims met with failure, as if the bodies in the limestone were both inhabiting the same space at the exact same time. There was a final attempt to try and find and kill whatever this thing was stalking the tunnels, using one of the regiment's tanks. But the machine guns in the tank didn't bother or harm whatever this thing was. It shrugged off the bullets and has somehow managed to move up and in through the metal armour of the tank, as easy as it had with the rock, pulling the tank crew to their deaths, leaving one poor sod literally trapped between the rock and the external armour, almost as if it had been left as a warning to others. After this, all the army could think to do was dynamite the cave entrance, and then hope that whoever was in there couldn't or didn't want to come out again. Donald Rich writes in his report that he'd got little idea whatever it was that had killed the soldiers back during the Great War. But from his time in the cave, he was sure that whatever the thing was, it was very much still alive and still stalking anybody hapless enough to enter its home. He makes some observations about the properties of the limestone, maybe combining with water runoff passing through it, potentially acting as a casing or a prison for this thing, with it only being able to move through the internal tunnels and the tank armour because they were protected, they were dry, there was no moisture in them. How whatever this thing was seemed to have the ability to change the nature of whatever material it moved through, a power it could turn on or off at will in order to trap or kill whatever it regarded as a threat or a trespasser. All these observations were passed on by the 4th Logistics Company, the wider army, and intelligence companies. But it doesn't reference that anything was done with them, or if there are any further attempts by the army after the 1950s to go back to the site. Which means that the tank, whatever attacked it, are likely still down there, buried under the surface of the Somerset countryside. And the people that live there can only pray that all the rainwater that flows through the gorge and the surrounding rivers, they never dry up. Because even today, there's no way anybody could stop whatever that thing is that's been down there, waiting for centuries.